the different dimensions of security to look at non-traditional security aspects, which seem to have always been there but have emerged in the forefront, particularly post-Cold War. And what could be the key takeaways for India? Harsh, over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Venkat, and thanks, everyone. It's once again, it's good to see you all. Those of you that I can see, and the rest are behind the screen. So, good to connect with you all today once again. This issue of non-traditional security and agenda is a very interesting one, because this has come back to us in a very interesting format in recent years, in recent times, in the last 2 years. If anyone would have thought that health security would be the prime focus of states across the world, and they would be looking at it as one of the most primary concern, that would have been unthinkable a few years back. And today, of course, the health crisis, the COVID crisis is at the front and center of how priorities are being redefined. But also interesting is how this has spawned, a new undertaking in the way we are questioning the engagement with broader security issues, and how in some ways a whole host of our assumptions have been challenged. We are questioning them. We are basically relooking at them. We are engaging with them much more substantively in ways that I think would not have been possible without COVID-19. Some of the trends were visible, for example, in the economic domain. The questions that perhaps Mr. Donald Trump was raising about American middle classes were quite relevant. But without COVID, they would not have gained the kind of urgency and agency that they have now. I thought what I will do is I'll give you a brief overview of the national security debate in academia, and how today, when we talk about national security agenda, traditional versus non-traditional security agenda, how this disjuncture between the academia and the policy establishment is playing out, and how interesting it has become, because in some ways policymakers are now driving the agenda. But of course, academia had always been talking about security calculus. So I'll just briefly give you an overview of the national security debate. If you go back to the academic literature, there's a famous quote by a famous political scientist from Yale, Arnold Wolfers, who basically said, look, national security is it's an ambiguous symbol. It can be anything to anyone. If you think of national security in some ways, it just, the way you define it, the way you shape it, the way you argue it, anything can be national security. And so it is very ambiguous at some level as to what exactly the national security paradigm is, or national security challenges. But what in practice happened, and I think in some ways that ambiguity stays with us even till date. If you're asking a policy practitioner what is the most important national security challenge today, they would say, well, COVID management of the health crisis. This would not be an answer you would be getting, say, 3 years back. But tomorrow, and once we are beyond COVID, perhaps we will get a different answer. So there is an inherent ambiguity about the concept. But post Second World War, when the world was coming to its own, and the world was trying to reset its own set of engagements, national security studies as a paradigm emerged. How do you engage with what is called as national security? And at that point in time, there were certain key features of this, right? One was, how do you, the two world wars had militarized the debate on foreign policy and national security. So the idea was that once you are moving away from the two wars to more setting up a global order, then the question became, how do you familiarize, how do you create, how do you generate expertise in the civilian realm when it in the area of national security after all that dominance of the military? And this was an interesting engagement in the European countries, in the Western countries, and in the sense that they were looking at rebuilding themselves economically, socially, politically, and there was a step back from all the militarization that had happened in the two wars, the First World War and the Second War. And I think at some point the question was that how do you understand the relationship between the use of force and policy making, and whether we can coordinate diplomatic, military, and diplomatic, economic, and military processes. And this was very important for a set of countries at that particular point in time, because again they were trying to rebuild themselves. They were trying to look at their relationship with the wider world through a different lens. And what started happening at that point in time was that countries started thinking, or analysts started thinking in terms of trade-offs. And this is very popular even today. For example, the first thing you hear in the national security class is this guns versus butter debate. But this is an old standing debate, fundamentally about resource allocation. And in Western Europe, in post Second World War, the idea was, what is the trade-off between greater military security and other national objectives like economic development or even individual freedom, because that was a time when the Western countries were talking about fighting the communists. So this debate, this engagement with this question of resource allocation, this question of developing civilian competence in thinking about military matters, the relationship between use of force and policy making, all of these questions were at the heart of how the national security establishment emerged in the immediate aftermath of post Second World War. And as the Cold War escalated, it is one can naturally expect what happened, that military once again started dominating, especially the issues around the use of armed force in international politics started dominating because of one particular factor, and that was the onset of the nuclear age. So if you go back to the sort of Western engagement, is particularly American role in shaping the national security discourse globally, it is very interesting because, after the initial phase where there is a recalibration in terms of thinking about national security, the moment nuclear arms race becomes the dominant paradigm in the Soviet Union, there is an inherent, the field of national security takes on a dimension of military security. And there you had a number of very interesting people like Albert Wohlstetter, Bernard Brodie, even Henry Kissinger, writing about the use of force and how do you calibrate use of force with political objectives, and whether or not nuclear weapons are political instruments of policy, or whether they are simply, or whether they are war-fighting instruments. So there is a very interesting engagement that is happening with the onset of nuclear weapons and how you think about the role of nuclear weapons. Do you think about the role of nuclear weapons as principally about war fighting, or do you think of them as political instruments? And there you had the entire Kissingerian logic, Henry Kissinger's logic of escalation ladder. How do you use, he views them as political instruments. He argues that these are essentially instruments that one can bargain with other countries. And so he has this interesting theory of nuclear escalation, how the threat of nuclear weapons itself producing a set of political objectives. So the idea is still there that the use of force is intricately linked to policy objectives, to political objectives. But there are a whole host of other theoreticians, other policy wongs, who started looking at an entirely different concept of how can you use nuclear weapons on the battlefield. And this, there's an entire theology. Those of you who have done nuclear, literature, those of you who have gone through the nuclear literature, would see an entire theology develops around this in late 60s and early 70s. But where I think all of it comes unstuck is in the Vietnam War in America, where America realized that for all its power, it was not able to shape the battlefield to its advantage. All these theories that were being enunciated by a number of very smart people, all of them Ivy League educated. There is an excellent book by David Halberstam, The Best and the Brightest, where he talks about how these great kids, great intellectuals who were part of the Kennedy establishment, then Lyndon Johnson, then Nixon, how all of them failed to foresee one principal aspect of policy making, that all war fighting theology in the absence of credible political objectives will lead to bad policy. That you can have, you can you can do all sorts of economic calculations, you can do all sorts of econometric calculations as to how much bombs will fall, and how much battle, what's the battle space, and whether you can bring the Vietnamese opposition to its knees. All of them did not work, because ultimately the political objectives were not in sync with the domestic political realities in the US. So there, the dimension of national security takes on a different turn, and national security at around that time those who are looking at this concept of national security, it starts looking at it fundamentally different referent objects. So you end up into that cycle where now academicians, policymakers are looking at national security through the prism of interdependence. So you had this famous book by Joe Nye and Robert Cohen, Power and Interdependence, which talks about how a national security of one country is dependent in some fundamental ways on the developments in the other country. And so there is an interlinkage that starts to develop, that ultimately countries are not living in isolation. They are not islands in their own right. They are engaged with each other, and therefore this interdependence is also going to shape their perspective on how they are going to tackle their national security challenges. And some of these challenges, of course, traverse boundaries, the national boundaries. So from that time, one starts looking at national security through a largely an expanded prism, and an economic dimension becomes very pertinent. Economic dimension in some ways takes over, because America at that particular point in time, the West at that particular point in time, is interested in expanding global, freedom of markets, stocking of free markets, expanding that domain, and is struggling against the Soviet Union that is talking of inward-looking economies. Now, that contestation in the national security discourse, that contestation in the way national security framework emerged, continues till the time you had the end of the Cold War. Now, end of the Cold War, of course, you had a very different landscape in early 1990s, where there is a lot of optimism, where there's a shift in focus away from the military. You all would know, this idea that this is Francis Fukuyama is talking of end of history. George W. Bush is talking of a new world order. You had globalization at its peak, and you had new concerns emerging that are driving people to question this assumption of national security primarily through the prism of the military, where you had questions like environment, like human rights, for example, becoming the dominant feature of the way the West and the dominant powers are looking at their national security, the way they are defining their concepts, and the way they are shaping the national security discourse. So from this is the time when you are also looking at this debate on whether the nation state is weakening, right? This idea that the nation state is besieged from all sides. You had the pressure from the top, where you have organizations like EU were becoming stronger. Various regional and global institutions were coming on its own. United Nations, because of the great power politics had subsided, United Nations Security Council was able to push through a number of resolutions, a number of push on external interventions. The 1990s is the period when a number of interventions happened, from, of course, Saddam Hussein's Kuwait being pushed out of Saddam Hussein's Iraq being pushed out of Kuwait to Bosnia. Then you have Kosovo, Somalia. So there are a whole host of these interventions that happened in the 1990s, but it seemed at that particular point in time that the major powers have similar views on the use of force in international system. And then by the time you sort of this is the above, the pressure from above on the nation state. There is a pressure from below on the nation state, where all sorts of irredentist tendencies are rising. You have terrorism rising, separatism rising. You have multinational corporations becoming very powerful. Globalization is weakening the nation state, and of course, this from state to human-centric development starts happening. That human rights become a very useful discourse to understand that it is ultimately the referent point of security is not the state but human beings. This idea again gathers momentum. So for a lot of these reasons, we see this shift from 1990s to this discourse of national security, where the dynamic of national security takes on a slightly different dimension than the traditional understood ones of the military. And I think by and large, if you there is a famous book by Barry Busan who talks of security of multiple frameworks: economic security, military security, environmental security, societal security, all kinds of, basically breaking down security into different realms and saying that, look, security depends on who the referent object is. If you are talking of the nation state, the nation state will look at its security through the prism of territorial integrity. And there the military instrumentality becomes the most important one. But if you're looking at the internal dimension of security, for example, then you will look at issues like economic redistribution, economic inequality, societal inequality. You would also look at this relationship between state and individuals. If you're looking at environmental issues where the pressure is on the environment, then the referent point is not nation state or individual, but large the global environment. And this is something that is being talked about today, that unless you prevent a crisis in one part of the world, it's unlikely that other parts will be spared. Similarly, like health crisis. And I think the point that countries like India have been making from the very beginning of this crisis, that unless everyone is vaccinated, no one is secure. So you need global vaccination. Countries cannot really look at this crisis from their own vantage points of territorial security, that we have enough vaccines, we will secure our population and all will be well. And this is something certainly not, this has not happened. And we have seen in the recent case of Omicron, how this traveled all the way from South Africa. So in a sense, the larger issue of global referent security being global referent point. So you can see the scale. There's an entire scale here. Global security, where issues like health and environment. Then you have nation security, where you have issues primarily of military or economic nature. And then you also have issues like individual level security. Who is the referent point of security? Then human rights, economic redistribution, societal redistribution, all those factors matter. So in some ways, the debate on national security, on the changing concept of national security, how nations perceive that security to be primarily through the prism of their own interest, or through the prism of regional interest, or through the prism of global interest, depends on who the referent point of that security is, and therefore they calculate it differently. And this has been the landscape with us for a while now, and largely well understood. That look, there are different conceptions of national security, there are different ideas of national security, and largely the national security domain has been expanding. Now, this is something that academics, if you read the academic literature, that had been very far advanced in this. Where academics have talked about this, as I've been mentioning, for a very long time, that security needs to be looked at. But there has also been two kinds of pushback. One pushback had been conceptual from academics themselves, that look, if everything is security, then the term security also loses its conceptual meaning. If everything is in human rights, you have climate is security, health is security, water is security, food is security, your military element, of course, is security, and then individuals' life and employment is security. Then how do you conceptualize this? What remains of the meaning of national security? If you overburden a concept with meanings that go far beyond its immediate conceptualization, then many academics argued that the word itself loses its meaning. Then you may not even have I think eventually you won't be treating national security very, very seriously as a concept. And this debate had been happening, and by and large, a lot of the academics in international relations have been looking at security through a relatively narrow prism, where the use of force is primarily looked at as the primary driver of security. How do you link use of force and security? And that had been the traditional conceptualization of security. But as the non-traditional element of security have expanded, and as we are talking about today, it's the policy makers who are shaping this discourse. It is very interesting. And here I would just point out a few things as to how the global security landscape is creating new realities for policymakers, from, of course, rise of China to climate change to counterterrorism to COVID pandemic. We are looking at the national security debate undergoing a very interesting transformation. Now, while the academic world had often talked about this, this holistic conception of national security, for a long time, practitioners But today, it's very interesting that it's the policymakers that are leading this new consensus on the need to fundamentally reassess our assumptions about national security thinking. And I start from the US because that's where, in some ways, this debate started before COVID. This was a process that started by former US President Donald Trump, which has been taken forward now with Biden administration. Now, look at some of the things that Biden administration has been saying. Biden's national security advisor has asserted that foreign policy is domestic policy and domestic policy is foreign policy. That the national security team's task in America today, according to Mr. Biden's national security advisor, is to reimagine American national security for the unprecedented combination of crises America faces at home and abroad. This includes the pandemic, economic crisis, climate crisis, technological disruption, threats to democracy, racial inequality, racial injustice, and all of that. And so, from an American national security perspective, we are looking at at this very interesting shift from, even in terms of articulation and structural positioning of American structures. Now, and this has been reiterated. This U.S. Secretary of State is on record to say that more than any other time in his career, the distinction between domestic and foreign policy has fallen away, and our domestic renewal and our strength in the world are completely intertwined. And Joe Biden, for example, himself campaigned on a foreign policy for the middle class, and he has been very open and explicit about the need to first invest in our own people, to sharpen our own innovative edge, to unite the economic might of democracies, to grow the middle classes and reduce inequality, so that we can effectively counter our adversaries, be it their predatory trade practices or be it their predatory military activities. Now, this is very, very interesting. That and this is not very different from Donald Trump's America First. Essentially the argument is that, look, we have to first invest in ourselves to make sure that we are able to counter those who are using the structural problems to their advantage, our adversaries. And there is a great bipartisan divide in the US that, at the end of the day, beyond military numbers, what matters is that we need a strong domestic industrial base. What matters in keeping Washington's preeminence alive is to make sure that America is at the cutting edge of critical technologies, that that there are supply chains that are resilient, that is critical infrastructure that is protected, that there is a sense of urgency. Statements from the leading power of the day, and they mean what. And this is a power that is militarily, even today, if you compare US and China, American military might is quite superior. So in a way, there is a recalibration of what that military might might mean for their national security calculus, in a sense that now it is being looked at through a slightly different lens. Now, see, some of us would argue that this is not a very new idea, right? All serious grand strategic thinking, especially in a democracy, at the end of the day, look for sustenance in popular public support, right? If you don't have public support, then it won't matter. So, but what happened, or what has happened, I think, is if you look at Mr. Trump's rise and his ideas, they have challenged they challenged both the liberals and conservatives in the US foreign policy establishment, as what they underscored was that there was a growing gulf between the policy community and American hinterland. Now, Biden administration and his team have learned those lessons. And so you see this restructuring of National Security Council with other elements of the White House, such as the National Economic Council, Domestic Policy Council, Office of Science and Technology, Office of Trade. So in a sense, what we are looking at is even an institutional shift in the way national security is being prioritized, is being articulated, is being shaped. Now, it is also interesting, and this is the last part of what I want to talk about, that even in India we have seen an interesting aspect of this engagement. There is a greater recognition of the challenges emanating from national security, from domestic vulnerabilities, and here when I say the non-traditional sector. Now, one of the most significant consequences of COVID-19 pandemic was underscored by Prime Minister Modi himself. One of the first things that he said in March or April 2020 was how deeply concerned he was about the over-dependence on one particular country. And in fact, what he was mentioning was over-dependence on Chinese manufacturing for critical supplies. Now, at a time when Indian armed forces were facing PLA across the LAC, this exposed India to this new realization that you have an over-dependence on overseas supply chains, and this is a national security challenge. It can't be looked anymore. And since then, we have seen how Indian government has worked to shore up domestic capacities in critical areas, and how the link with free trade agreements is being looked at through a new lens. We have also had what is also interesting in Indian context is some of the recent remarks, some of the recent statements by Indian army chiefs have been very interesting. And again, here I would quote Indian Army Chief who last year argued that national security comprises not only warfare and defense, but also financial security, health security, food security, energy security, environment security, apart from information security. And suggested that instead of viewing national security primarily from the perspective of an armed conflict, there is a need for a whole of government approach towards security. Now, some of these things sound quite commonsensical. But when you look at how we are structured, how governments are structured, how state institutions are structured, it's not so easy to formalize them into outcomes. And so in a post-pandemic world where there is going to be a serious strain on national resources, it will be very important for policymakers to think about synergies between civilian and military affairs. Now, I think the country's entire national security strategy, any nation's national security strategy, the resources it allocates, the threats and opportunities it prioritizes, the relationships it cultivates, the external environment that it tries to shape, in some ways has to be geared towards towards reviving its domestic capabilities, so that those domestic capabilities eventually allow that country to play a larger role in securing its interests and in enhancing those interests. So in some ways, this debate between traditional and non-traditional security has taken an entirely new dimension in the last 2.5 years. And I hope and I think that this is leading to some of the more more serious thinking, both in academia and in policy, as to what is the role that the kind of national security paradigm with which we have operated so far, that will play in the coming years. Because what is very clear is that countries increasingly will have to look at their national security through the whole of government approach. In the past, it was a luxury perhaps, but in the future, it's going to be a necessity, given the kind of challenges that are being identified, the kind of and the resource constraints that are going to be the norm, at least in the short term. So I think with that, I would end, and I would be happy to hear your questions, comments, and observations.
Thank you, Harsh. Once again, I think you've kept it very, very concise and tried to actually encapsulate what is quite a broad topic, in the sense that, as you rightly pointed out, non-traditional security today possibly means everything. And some interesting points, of course, you made is about how policymakers have recognized that the ambit of national security has now expanded hugely. And in many ways, I think you made this observation about how they are driving the agenda. Also, this observation of this distinction that has existed earlier between domestic and foreign policy has now probably completely got eliminated, and it's got intertwined in some sense. A third important point I think you made is about the need for a whole of government approach. I think this is something that is very well recognized, and you've rightly spoken about what the Prime Minister said, what the Army Chief, that statement he made publicly. So I think there is a clear recognition, at least from the highest levels of decision making within the government. And another very interesting and important point you made is the synergy between civilian and military sort of interface. And in that sense, the more recent, I think, emphasis of dual use infrastructure is I think something that again clearly indicates that we are moving in that direction. So I think a number of interesting points Harsh has made, and I think this sets the platform or the foundation for us to have a good discussion. The idea, as I mentioned day before yesterday when Harsh was with us, was to have these really short and sharp discussions where we would have more of interactions, more opportunities for students and other representatives who are here to ask questions, make comments, and add to the discourse. And one of the things we attempt to do is to try and make some sense out of all of these discussions, and finally, probably put down some very precise notes and then send it out to various stakeholders, both in the government and outside. So that's the connect we have in terms of providing inputs into policy making. So let me stop there and let me open up. Once again, we have a very diverse crowd here, a number of experts from different domains, and I think if I could request all of you, please, to either feel free to raise your hand and I'll come to you and you could ask a question. Or you want to put in a comment in the chat box, please feel free, and I think either Harsh or I could read out to him, whatever is convenient. And please request, please keep your comments or your questions as precise as possible so that we can take as many and also give maximum time to Harsh to respond. Thank you. And okay, anyone? I think we generally have a very slow start and then it catches up. Okay. So we've got Aditya, who's of course one of our emerging scholars in the military school here at Rashtriya Raksha University. Yes, Aditya.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. It's always pleasure to listen to Professor Pant. Professor, I would like to hear from you. You just mentioned about Secretary Blinken's comment that domestic policy has become very much part of the foreign policy and vice versa. So, sir, but as we look at the problem that comes out from here, if a domestic policy of a country becomes part of the foreign policy, and then there is a very much chance of creating political ruckus in that country, and it poses a new level of challenge to the policymakers, how to deal and how to go about that. For example, we looked at the Maldivian crisis, where India had to face some kind of crisis situation, and they had this India out movement. So what kind of recommendations we can actually, or what kind of precautions we can look at to to contain those derailments that can arise out of the domestic policy becoming a part of the domestic policy being used by the other by the opponents to create ruckus in that country.
See, Aditya, I think in some ways democracies are always vulnerable to that because of the very nature of the institution that we have, that it is. And I think two things. One is, I think what Blinken was saying, perhaps he was coming to it from a different vantage point. When he was saying foreign policy is domestic and domestic is foreign, for him that was largely directed at the American audience. That look, uh, unless our foreign policy priorities take forward the interest of the American hinterland, America's developmental issues, there is no point in having a foreign policy. We can talk about the world, but unless we are weak at home, we won't be able to mobilize support for any policy abroad. So I think so that's a slightly different argument in some ways. One can say, for example, similarly in India's case, this idea that we have to develop our domestic manufacturing, right? The domestic defense capabilities. This is important because only then you would be able to be a good, a reasonably important player in the global hierarchy. You can't really have Chinese doing all the manufacturing for you and you become a service provider. That clearly does not work, and that clearly does not have any legs to stand upon over the long term. So that's one dimension of the domestic and foreign issue. The other dimension that you are raising, I think, is certainly something that all democracies have to be very careful about. That look, if there are vulnerabilities domestically, then your adversaries who are closed, who are authoritarian, who are who use information as warfare will certainly exploit that. Therefore, there are two things here. One, from a national security perspective, those vulnerabilities should be kept in mind. That look, we have these vulnerabilities, societal, they can be religious, they can be economic based, they can be information based, where there is a lack of information, and those vulnerabilities are open to be exploited by others because that's the kind of world we live in. You can easily, and we know that that has been happening, right? Information warfare, misinformation campaigns, disinformation campaigns, even cyber warfare is part of that. So in some ways, technology allows you to do that. Technology allows your adversaries to exploit those vulnerabilities. So you have to be cognizant of those challenges, and you have to ensure that those challenges are managed in a way that your adversaries find difficult to exploit them. So in a way that is always going to be this there is often this this challenge that open societies face vis-a-vis closed societies, and I think in the last few years there has been a greater recognition has come to the fore about that look, it's not as simple as saying that let's trade with China more, China will become like us. China did not become like us. Instead, China exploited your openness. So now the situation is so bad that even the Chinese students who are going out and studying in countries like Australia or even New Zealand or Britain or France or America, they are being looked at with suspicion. Because that's the paradigm that Chinese themselves have used to a large extent, and that's incredibly. I think we are moving into a terrain where the divisions are becoming starker, and that that's something that the Chinese have been exploiting. Chinese have been interfering in the political processes. That has been one of the biggest complaints of the Australians, right? So I think that is going to happen. You have to create firewalls so that that does not happen, but at the same time take measures where you can to make sure that those vulnerabilities are taken care of domestically. So domestic conversations about these aspects, domestic bringing in various stakeholders to make them aware. I don't think we were, we all of us used to talk that there might be a problem, but until people started researching and finding evidence, the scale of Chinese intrusion into the academic environment. I mean, who thought that academics would be called out and said, Singapore had to shift back a Chinese academic, a very famous Chinese academic, because he was he was thought to be colluding with the Chinese Communist Party. So in a sense, we are living in a world where all these questions are being raised, academia is being challenged, researchers are being challenged, and free exchange of science and technology is becoming a problem with certain countries. But that is something that maybe some countries have decided that that's the way to go, and now they'll have to pay the costs for it. So I think as a nation we should be aware of it, but those vulnerabilities will be there in any open society. Those vulnerabilities will be there.
Thank you, Harsh. I think there are a couple of questions in the chat box. Abhinaba, again, another emerging scholar at RRU. I think this is possibly linked to the comments you made on India and China. I think he's talking about the asymmetry that exists in conventional capabilities, and whether the development of non-traditional sort of national capabilities would be a way to address this asymmetry in conventional capacities. And if whether the Chinese view if yes, is this the Chinese view of its own progress ahead? Interesting. That's one. And the second one is from Ankita, again, someone who's closely associated with our school. How does the changing role of national security from its traditional to the more dynamic has changed the actual persuasion of the dynamic form of national security, especially considering the ongoing situation in Afghanistan and Myanmar?
Well, in terms of this conventional and non-traditional, I think this is an interesting point, because certainly Chinese have looked at this very carefully, because they have almost become the masters of on this, and I think it goes. Even when you look at their military, for example, engagement, right, with the US, they were looking at it. They were not, at least in the initial phase, they were not trying to build every warship and compete with the Americans. Their anti-access, area denial tactics were largely premised on this idea that they have inferior capabilities, they have limited capabilities, but they would invest in a manner that would prevent Americans from gaining their objectives in that part of the maritime space. Now, of course, since then they have moved ahead, and now they have much more capability. But for a time, that was their thinking. And certainly, I think they use all the instrumentalities of state power, as we were discussing earlier. They were, in their engagement with the West, in their engagement with the democracies. They have been quite explicit about the fact that they wanted certain advantages to be bestowed on them through their interaction with the West, and they got those advantages without actually opening up to the West, themselves to the West. And this also applies to India, right? So if you look at it, the trade balance that India struggles with the Chinese, there is a reason that Indian service sector, Indian pharmaceutical industry, Indian IT sector is not open for Chinese have not opened their markets for India. Now that in some ways there is an asymmetry that they use to their advantage. There is also information asymmetry that they use to their advantage, which is all of what we talk about. We operate in an open political system. They don't. So they are willing and able to exploit those vulnerabilities to their advantage, whereas at times we can't. So yes, I think that is how they have made a lot of their gains. The question is whether they are sustainable. See, once global democracies start banding together and start talking about the kind of costs that are being imposed on them because of Chinese behavior, then I think China might, some of the things that the world is doing today in terms of blocking China in critical sectors, in terms of reducing science and tech cooperation with the Chinese, that will have an effect on the Chinese. It may be that it is somewhat late in the day, but I think the world's democracies have indeed woken up. While China may have had its own advantages so far, I think whether those advantages are sustainable now remains an open question. And I think this is also this linked to the second question of dynamic national security, changing national security perspective, traditional form to what kind of issues we are witnessing in Afghanistan and Myanmar. In both cases, we are witnessing grave refugee crisis, humanitarian crises, border crisis, border instability, trafficking, narco trafficking, all sorts of issues that are embedded in the way we look at security. So the solution to Afghanistan and Myanmar is clearly not a purely militaristic solution. It is also the solution is embedded in an understanding that ultimately a politically stable Afghanistan is important. Ultimately, a politically stable Myanmar is important, and so there are the solutions are broader than simply saying Americans tried for 2 decades, they could not militarily defeat the Taliban. Similarly, the world tried for several decades. And they sanctioned Myanmar, but Myanmar continued to operate. And Myanmar, for a limited time, some democratic space was given to NLD, and now the Myanmarese junta is back in action. So ultimately, the question is not simply about using kinetic forms of warfare or kinetic instrumentalities of statecraft. The question is also whether one can look at these problems in a way that are embedded in the larger regional framework, whether that is a political reconciliation, whether the political inclusiveness that India. It is interesting for in both Afghanistan and Myanmar, India has talked about political inclusive nature of political structures, because unless you have those fundamentals in place, it would be very difficult to achieve security in Afghanistan and Myanmar. What you can have is limited time of stability in Afghanistan and Myanmar. But I think long-term security will be elusive because the fundamentals would not be in place, whether it is in terms of political security, whether it is in terms of economic rehabilitation, economic development, or whether it is in terms of individual security, which is equally important. That ultimately the human beings in Afghanistan and Myanmar are suffering. So I think at every level, security is being decreased by the inability of the Afghanistan and Myanmarese elite, as well as global stakeholders, to understand how to intervene and how to make a difference in these countries.
Thank you, Harsh. I think we have a question from Niranjan Oak. Yes, Niranjan.
Hello, sir. Sir, thanks for the presentation. Sir, you rightly mentioned that when the word security is used with health security, energy security, all security, the word security loses its core meaning. So do you think we need a different, fresh theorization of this mixing up of security and non-security? I mean, for example, in Southeast Asia, every year there is haze problem. Now, haze problem directly affects population of 3 countries majorly, Singapore, Indonesia and Malaysia. But nobody looks at it from the national security point of view. So whenever some country uses a tool to harm someone, then the word security should come into place. I mean, the recent coronavirus, when China is not letting out the information, so one can say that it may be a part of Chinese strategy to achieve some objectives. So do you think that we need to redefine and re-theorize this entire paradigm of non-traditional security, where what the word security should mean, that must be explicit? Thank you.
See, Niranjan, as you would know, this is an old standing debate, right? So this push and pull between those who want this to be expanded and those who don't want to be expanded is something that has been going on for far too long. And my own sense is that theorizing has reached a stage where you can't really do more theorizing. I think that and therefore when theories fail, what is interesting and how sometimes things evolve is when practitioners make a different choice, right? So my own sense is that what is now happening and the way policymakers are looking at some of these questions will perhaps lead to its own set of new theories. So I don't think we need to relive those old debates. I think what we may now be forced to do as if one is primarily an academic and the business of academia is to look at some of these conversations that policymakers are doing with these ideas. And that's why I mentioned some of those things, because I think what policymakers are suggesting is that they are uncomfortable with the traditional, with the overly militaristic focus on security. Now, whether or not this is a permanent disenchantment, or whether or not whether this is temporary because of COVID-19 and everyone is but I think what we have seen in the US, for example, we have moved from Trump to Biden, and there seems to be, when Mr. Trump was talking about some of these things, right, when he was putting pressure on China, or when he was talking about trade being a security problem, I think a lot of the people thought this is merely Mr. Trump being Mr. Trump. But I think when Mr. Biden says it, there is a certain continuity, and there is a certain realization that perhaps what America is now saying is that, look, we are facing a problem domestically. We have a domestic problem. And unless our domestic institutions are strengthened to a point where we can take on the adversary, we will be vulnerable on the national security front. Now, if they are making this argument, then I think it changes the debate automatically, because then for academia, we'll have to engage with this perspective that what is happening. So we have been talking about traditional, non-traditional, Barry Busan's framework, this framework, that framework, but ultimately it's a policymaker's decision to take some of these ideas into account and shape them accordingly. And what we had seen so far, as I was articulating the larger historical shifts, largely the militaristic aspect had dominated precisely because of what you were pointing out, that it becomes so complex. If you make everything part of security, then for a policymaker, he or she can't do justice to the term and to the policy making. So I think you carve out these niches. Now what is happening is, for a range of factors, and by the way, there is a traditional element here. Rise of China is one of the most important element here. The rise of China and what China is doing with all the institutional frameworks, with all our understanding of norms and ideas, that is leading, I think, policymakers into a new phase of thinking about this challenge. And therefore, the traditional versus non-traditional will certainly, in my opinion, will be redefined. But how they will be done, maybe your generation will do it. But I think at the moment, these are still early days. These are still early days in terms of this conceptualization, and the world is getting more and more divided, right? So I think that division will also be reflected in some of these questions that will be asked. Even what you consider as traditional security, non-traditional security, right? Health. Now, health has become today the center point of what you are pointing out, a center point of contention in a traditional sense. You have great power competition over health. China does not want to release information. West wants information. We want information. We are pushing WHO in one direction. They are pushing WHO in another direction. They want to avoid Taiwan. We want to bring in Taiwan in the WHO Council. So, even our non-traditional theaters are becoming more traditional. So perhaps the way to look at it might not be traditional versus non-traditional, but to go back to some of the original foundations of security and see that everything that we used to think of as non-traditional is actually now part of a traditional discourse. Environmental concerns, right? Environmental concerns are tied up with our economic concerns. Economic concerns are tied up with issues on trade and technology, supply chains. All of these issues are interconnected, and if they become contested, if great powers, major powers contest these terms, then I think rather than cooperation, you are going to get more contestation, and that will in itself redefine the boundaries of traditional versus non-traditional.
Thank you. That's a good question. Anurup, do you want to go first? Yes.
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir. Sir, I would like to ask you your point of view about, sir, about powerful countries, regardless of their structure, political structure. Are they more going towards mercantile economy? When we think about like making India, or we are becoming more self-reliant, we are also relegating the liberal ideas of comparative advantage to one point. So, is these powerful countries moving towards mercantile economy these days?
Anurup, I think my own sense is that the economic globalization paradigm with which we have lived so far is being reassessed, and if that if you have a situation where the guarantors of liberalization, like the Western countries, are now saying that, look, we have to first take care of America first, right? Or Europe first. And India says, make in India. I think the question there is that the divisions in the global power hierarchy are now shaping our understanding of what globalization can and cannot accomplish. And I think I don't think that makes India or even the Western countries mercantilist. What it does is that it takes us in a different direction of cooperation. Like, for example, the whole idea of what was the traditional assumption of trade? The political argument of trade was that, look, let's trade and become friends. If we trade more with each other, we'll become friends, right? Now it has been turned on its head. Now the argument today is, let's trade only with friends, because that's where we are comfortable. That's where the supply chains, why are they being restructured? Why do you not want China to be over dependent on China? Because there is a political reasoning to the whole logic of economic globalization has now come to the fore. That the economic, what you called economic liberals, I think, are having a hard time defending some of the consequences of that economic liberalism for societies like the US, for example. And even for India, I mean, how do you make India more economically balanced or less iniquitous without having a strong manufacturing base in the country? It's all very well for the Indian services sector to rise, but services sector cater to such a small proportion. All of us can't be service sector professionals. So how do you manage that societal inequalities, economic inequality, without actually doing some of the fundamental restructuring the economic setup? And countries, by and large, are recognizing that challenge. I don't think that makes them mercantilists. I think what it does is it certainly gives them a different perspective on economic interactions with each other. So I think from now onwards, the kind of economic engagements that you will see, free trade agreements that you will see, bilateral economic partnerships that you will see them through a very different lens. What are some of the economic free trade agreements that India is talking about today? It is talking about with some of the countries that are its closest partners: UAE, UK, Australia, South Korea. These are the countries with which India wants to do a free trade agreement. India doesn't want to do a free trade agreement like RCEP. India doesn't want to be part of RCEP because India feels that RCEP will compromise its domestic economic security. Then RCEP would ultimately lead to China flooding Indian markets. Now, again, that assumption may or may not be right, but I think what I'm telling you is that this is the perspective from an Indian policy maker, that how the conception of economic logic has changed, that politics is now in the driving seat. You are looking at the economic engagement through a different lens, and that will have consequences.
Yeah, before I come to, I think, Kritika's question in the chat box, Mr. Heblikar, of course, who's with us. Sir, if you could briefly, just add in your observations, comments. I know you've got to go into another meeting. If you're there, sir, maybe there was a question on Myanmar, and I know you've been doing a lot of work in those areas. Heblikar, sir, are you there? Okay, I don't know whether we seem to have lost, yeah, it seems like he's lost connectivity. All right, so let me just quickly go to Kritika's question. And I think Kritika has spoken about choosing between national security and environmental security and what should be our approach but balancing. I'm assuming the larger context is about how do you prioritize the different dimensions of security, and how do you prioritize how do you balance between development and security? I think that's the question, Harsh.
Yeah, Kritika, thank you. Kritika, I think when you think of prioritization in national security, again, as I mentioned, this whole debate has been going on from the very beginning, right? Guns versus butter. How do you prioritize? Where do you put your priorities? And people have been talking of. Some people have said why have gone to the extreme of saying no need for any guns, invest all in butter. And if you see different models operating in the world, in real world as well, I think for any nation state, it will always be a challenge to allocate resources proportionately, because you always will have times where one or the other element of security would dominate, right? At the moment, we are all focused on health. We all want vaccines. We all want best of health care. There's going to be a lot of pressure on countries to provide that health care, and so there'll be prioritization of health sector for a considerable period of time. Similarly, environment. When you have for a long time, no one was listening to the environmentalists. For a long time, people were putting it ahead. I think in some cases, not necessarily because they did not want to prioritize environment, because the idea was that, look, this is a bit long-term problem, but we have more short-term issues here to deal with. What do we do with them? And I think it is always difficult in an economic sense. If you look at the developmental question, even today, how do you, as a policymaker, as a politician, if you are a politician, how do you tell a family, on the lower end of the economic spectrum, that is now beginning to gain traction? Oh my God, don't buy a two-wheeler, don't buy a car, because that's detrimental to to the environment. But that person who is just about to begin, he or she, when he or she's about to get into the economic game, he or she is about to generate enough resources to get a car. To tell him or to tell her that, look, don't buy this vehicle, or don't use public transport. That, I think, that is a very difficult question for a policymaker to assess in developing context, in a developing country context, because at the end of the day, economic aspiration is also important for that individual, and for the government to be dictating these sorts of issues often becomes a huge issue. So my own sense is that in terms of prioritization, it will always be, it will inevitably be dictated by the circumstances of the countries. It is never a black and white situation. Environment, for example, if you look at even the developed world today, there is an economic crisis brewing there, the pandemic and post-pandemic. Now, in that environment, environmental concerns will certainly take a back seat for a while at least. And therefore, I think a lot of this prioritization depends on the immediate circumstances that we face. But yes, mature societies, mature polities, they do take a long-term view of the problem, and that is why I think this idea of strategic mapping is so important. That 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, which are the challenges that are going to be the most important for you, and how will you have enough resources to tackle them? And that is why you cannot leave everything to 5-year-old governments. They come every 5 years. But I think you need an institutional apparatus that is able to define your long-term agenda, and that is able to that is able to guide resource allocation in a manner that can balance the short-term and long-term effectively. It is very difficult, but I think that's why you need long-term strategic planning, and that is why there has been so much priority being put on long-term strategic planning. Hopefully, hopefully this is something that we will get better at as we go forward.
Thank you, Harsh. Dr. Shraddha, my colleague at the school, asks what is the US doing in case of inward-looking policy is something that the developing countries have been demanding since the last 3 decades. Does that imply that the US condition is bad and that it is merely playing or posturing as a superpower?
Venkat, can I take the other question as well, so that
sure, yeah. Kshitij has asked a question that the Indian subcontinent is affected by terror and is also vulnerable to climate change. Both these factors may lead to large-scale refugee crisis. How should India prepare for this crisis, as it may affect our economic and social security?
Thanks. Yeah, I think when we talk of the inward orientation in the US, there is I'm not so sure why whether the developing countries have been demanding inward orientation from the US, because I think there is a lot of concern around the world about America's inward orientation. I think for a lot of countries in America, that is globally engaged is a good thing. But I think what inward orientation in the US at the moment means is that this idea that they want to certainly focus on their domestic strengths and building those domestic strengths. Which also implies what you are asking, Shraddha, is that certainly the situation in the US is one which is if not bad, then certainly of concern to policymakers in the US. I think there is a genuine concern that, look, unless we take care of what is happening within the country, unless we manage some of these issues, whether of economic inequality, social inequality, infrastructure development, or institutional development, it would be very difficult to counter the US. I don't think it's playing superpower. It is one of the most, if not the most important power in the world. But certainly, what has happened is that power has become diffused. You have China, of course, has risen, but other nations have also risen. So that diffusion of power means that that America's ability to wield power the way it used to do in the 1990s is no longer there. And once it is not there, the question is what can be done. And as China comes in with its bag of resources, what can America do to challenge some of that, and what can America do to help its friends and allies? I think that is another important factor. And there, one of the most important things that American policymakers are today saying is that one of the most important things America can be a credible actor is to build its own domestic capability. So I think, therefore, there is a lot of emphasis on inward orientation, inward building of capacities, looking at its own internal challenges, and trying to work out a way whereby it can continue to play the kind of a role that it has played in the world. The Kshitij, I think terrorism, of course, and climate change, and you're right that we are going to see a lot of refugee crisis, and this is something that we are already witnessing around the world. Refugee crisis is at an all-time high, and the questions that the challenges that Europe is facing on the refugee front, for example, because of various factors, including climate change and terrorism in Middle East, have led to some strange issues in Europe, both political, economic, and societal. And that's something that one has to be aware of, that look, whenever you have influx of people, refugees or otherwise, in any country, it does change the domestic landscape. And when it does that, there are different stakeholders within who then try to take advantage of that imbalance, and that causes a lot of economic and social insecurity. So I think this is a huge question as to how should India prepare, because I think ultimately the preparation is, once again, is domestic, in the sense that India should be in a position to have an economic and social policy in place that allows for a modicum of external actors to come into the system and play a role, and be and to absorb that refugee population. To be able to absorb that refugee population, you need to have an economic and social policy that allows that fusion to happen. And for that, again, the focus should be on building domestic economic capabilities, domestic institutional capabilities, unless otherwise, the refugee crisis of a different magnitude, which is something that we can't really comprehend. But I think if it is manageable, if you think that it is going to be manageable to an extent that that India as a nation can absorb that, then I think what India needs to focus on is to build its own domestic economic and social capacities, and that is something that will work both whether or not that refugee problem happens. But I think largely by focusing on domestic institution building, domestic capabilities, we also prevent some of the other challenges that may or may not emerge in the future.
Thank you, Harsh. I think on the US leadership question, there have been, if one looks at the history also of the United States, there have been phases, multiple phases when it has looked inward, isn't it, Harsh? And there have been phases when it has been engaged more actively. So that's, I think, a useful point to consider as part of that narrative. Very quickly, I know Mr. Heblikar is back, and sir, if you could just maybe add in, it's always useful insight for our students. Please, sir.
Thanks, Venkat. Good afternoon, Professor Pant, my young colleagues at RRU and other places. I think I have been treated to a very interesting fair today afternoon, and I've listened very intently. And I think the narrative is headed in the right direction. I would like to place 2 or 3 points for consideration. It perhaps holding your hands, Venkat, or walking the talk with Professor Pant. I feel that in India's context, purely in Indian context, national security can no longer be seen or understood in its narrow military terms. And national security in India needs to be expressed. What are our national security interests and objectives? These have not come as part of a codified or a doctrinal approach. Like, for example, what the Communist Party of China has said, its national security interests and objectives are no discussions on the future of Tibet, no discussions on the future of Taiwan, no discussion on trade matters. I think China is steadfast. He says in other cases, and no discussions on maritime or land frontiers. So that's going to be the cornerstone of China's national security policy for years to come. But for countries like ours, which are developing today, I think the very fact that national security is not fully pronounced, you can get a glimpse of it in what the Ministry of Defense puts out, or the Ministry of External Affairs, or the Ministry of Home Affairs. So that's one area that we got to look at national security in the Indian sense. I also think national security means your comprehensive economic strength, that you are able to become the bulwark of your foreign policy and your defense policy. The third point, which I think we need to understand, is as we grow into a $5 trillion or a $10 trillion economy, we have to start looking 5 to 10 years ahead. For example, today, your telecom sector has now graduated to becoming a traditional national security factor along with your pharma industry. So you have got more people who have migrated to the traditional side, and some have remained on the non-traditional side. We need to look at a scenario where you have capacity building, skills building. We don't have that to service a largely national security oriented system. I'll give an example. We just spoke about migration and economic climate change. 30 years from now, when the Sundarbans of Bangladesh go underwater 5 feet, some 30 million Bangladeshis are going to be displaced. Today, Dhaka and Chittagong have slums that were not there 20 years ago. So 15, 20 years from now, where will this migration head? It can't go into the Bay of Bengal because Bangladesh is like a horseshoe, 3 sides India, 1 of Bay of Bengal. Where does this population head? It has to come to India. So are we in a position to create mechanisms and systems to deal with? I think these are the issues that from the traditional point of view, security point of view, people look at. No amount of barbed wire fencing is going to help us. So I think barbed wire fencing between India and Bangladesh today is more in breach than in practice. So I think the young students who need to understand the traditional national security factors and non-traditional ones, I think we need to get our fundamentals very clear vis-a-vis India itself. Other countries in our neighborhood can follow, but I think we need to have a deeper study, a deeper understanding. So that's where I think I'll leave this discussion. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to more engagements on this particular and interesting subject. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I think that those are really valuable points, especially for students who are doing research on India's national security. Harsh, I don't think there are any more questions, so I'm going to ask you 2 quick ones before we sort of conclude. One, of course, is taking off from Mr. Heblikar sir's comments. And this, this debate that's been going on, particularly in the academia and the larger strategic community, about putting out a national security strategy document, right? Now there are merits and demerits to putting out something and not putting out. I'm just wondering now, with the expanded dimensions of security, whether one should put out a more narrower sort of national security strategy, which is focused on, how do we deal with some of the more non-traditional challenges. If we really don't want to explicitly put down how we deal with the traditional challenges, but more with the non-traditional challenges. So do you think that could be something that we could go forward with? One. And second, of course, is again, I suppose this will be a bit speculative, but from your perspective, particularly from India's, viewpoint, how do you, how would you outline the contours of a future conflict in the Indian context? considering what all we've said now. Thank you, Ash.
Venkat, I think on the first question, I do think that a broad outline is often helpful. You would recall this whole debate on India's nuclear doctrine. We don't have it's not a very detailed doctrine, but there are certain principles that the government enunciated. And I think they have been very helpful in various ways in terms of articulating India's position, in terms of just laying out the foundations of in India's role as a responsible nuclear actor, in terms of India's own developmental priorities of the capabilities that India has been developing in the nuclear realm. So my own sense is that there is. I don't particularly see very many costs associated with articulating a bare minimum national security strategy. And it may not be called a national security strategy. You can have a different nomenclature for that. But I think if you are talking of sort of a perhaps in the non-traditional dimension, if we can lay out. My concern there would be that, given the interlinkages between traditional and non-traditional, how would you differentiate? If you are, for example, talking of technology and supply chains and trade, you are, which is non-traditional in some ways, or if you're looking at, piracy or things. I think there ultimately a lot of the questions are getting intertwined with the great power politics, and so at times you might end up doing mixed messaging without achieving the result. So you will neither end up clarifying your positions because you'll be couching them in a language, and you will end up also alienating a lot of factors. So I don't know whether it might be that easy to do. On the conflict scenario, I think if we are looking at what kind of a conflict it might be, I would say that for all the challenges that we are witnessing along our border, India has shown that we are capable of standing up to those challenges. So my own sense would be that domestic, conflict might be our vulnerability, because there it's easy to spark a fire there, and given that we are a democracy where we like like all democracies, we have various vantage points. It is very interesting, in the American context. If you see the debate today, there is a lot of consensus about the possibility of a civil war in the US over the next decade or so. A lot of the futurologists are talking about it now, and I think given that given what we know about the US and given what we know about India is a very, very different case. But what I'm saying here is that domestic vulnerabilities are one of our biggest challenge, and they can be exploited by those who do not mean as well relatively easily. And the costs for us would be very high, and costs for them would be very low. So that, I think, is something that we need to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, it's fascinating you end off on that point, because that brings us to the first question that Aditya spoke about. The how external actors could actually influence some of our domestic, especially the political process, and this combined with, if I could say, social unrest, would probably be one of the challenges, and also the fact that you have a combination of maybe a cyber and some kind of a low intensity asymmetric. I think these would possibly be the biggest challenges. So thank you, Harsh, on that. On the nuclear policy, I think that's interesting, because I suppose there was a lot more sustained international questions and pressure in the late 90s for us to actually be very clear in terms of how we would handle the nuclear question, which I suppose is not there when it comes to the strategy. I think the pressure is more internal on that rather than external. So I suppose, but I am aware that there's been a lot of deliberations that's happened within, and I'm sure you are also aware. And we can only hope that something moves forward on that front. I think with that note, I would like to conclude, and I don't think anybody would contest if I say this has been an extremely fascinating session. In fact, a couple of sessions day before yesterday and on today dealing with extremely pertinent topics having significant implications for India's national security. One, of course, is the terrorism question, and the second is on how the ambit of security has evolved and expanded massively. I think Harsh has displayed immense clarity in terms of conceptual clarity and his thoughts, which has made it a lot more easier, I'm sure, to a number of our students to take down notes, and as well as we'll continue, discussing some of his observations and some of the offshoots in our classes moving forward. I can't thank you enough, Harsh. I know, you're not one for formalities, but still I would like to place on record our sincere appreciation on behalf of the school, on behalf of the university, for taking time out during the day, during work hours, and spending time with our students. And I'm sure that they would find this extremely useful. We hope to continue to have you sort of guide us and give us inputs as we move forward, not just on the syllabus, but also in terms of what should be our vision, what kind of activities should we take up moving forward on an annual basis. I think these are all questions, and you already know that we've been discussing about something more specific on which, again, we'd like your inputs. With that, I would, again, on behalf of the audience, thank you, Harsh, for your time. I would like to thank everyone who's joined us. Heblika, sir, who's been a constant support. He's joined us all the way from Bangalore. We've got a number of others here. Ankita from Delhi, for example. Niranjan, I think, has joined us. And a number of them. I may not be able to take all your names, but again, from our other schools, I can see representatives from the forensic school. Our director of criminology was here. Some of my colleagues at my own school, my administrative officer, Mr. Dushyant, who's actually been doing all the work behind the scenes. And then, of course, we had a couple of guests from Afghanistan also who joined in, who were actually research scholars with us. Maybe all the way from Kabul. One of them is probably there. The other, of course, Kamal, is on screen here. So I want to once again thank every one of you, and please continue to join and participate in what we call the Lavard Confab on National Security. The idea is to keep this precise, to have more interactions, to get multidisciplinary students on one platform, so that all of you can interact with one another and we can get a comprehensive sort of outlook on each and every topic. As RRU's logo goes, national security is supreme, and those are the issues that we focus on and we'll continue to focus on. Please continue to stay in touch with us. I think we send out a news bulletin every day. I hope a lot of you receive it. I know there are a lot of news bulletins that are there all around the world, but even if you are able to find something useful there, we'll be very happy, and we are trying to bring people together. So that's the entire objective. Thank you once again to each and every one of you. Thank you to my colleagues at the school. Harsh, thank you once again. And
thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harsh. Thank you. Have a nice evening, everyone. Thank you. Harsh, I've sent you a separate link. So thank you. Thank you, everyone. Take care, please. Bye.